So great was the dedication to the useless mindfulness, as Heidegger puts it in his 38-39 lectures, that even here, as the war is getting ready to rage across Europe, not to say the whole world, Heidegger is still insisting upon it in his introductory remarks to his students. And he wants to know what this useless mindfulness is, and a thinker like Nietzsche. I've been emphasizing, and I think anybody who wanted to write a thesis and make a strong case for Heidegger contradicting himself innumerable times could easily do that by looking at his lectures and citing evidence for that. But then we in some way miss the spirit of his investigation. Let me make a remark about Aristotle's version of I've been using the word concept. So concept, in a way, when I say that, I think of the tradition of metaphysics, and this is a depreciatory term in Heidegger's, not necessarily in Heidegger's vocabulary. Sometimes he speaks of the properly philosophic concept, but he speaks more often of determinations, and ultimately he wants to get to the, if you look at his essays on the I think it's the hermeneutics of facticity, facticitat. That's what he wants to get to. Facticitat, or facticity for Heidegger, is the datum that corresponds to Dasein as such, not to the concept of Dasein, but to it seems almost wrong to say the experience, but in any case, also when I was speaking of the cogency, what's the cogency? The cogency means that we're genuinely impressed that something is true. I mean, simple case, one sees, let's say, a door, one apprehends a door, there's a door before me, and yeah, what could be more cogent than that? But at the same time, this can happen with ideas. Leo Strauss gave once the example of a dictative reason. He said, if you hold a vote, you have to have it so that the people with the greater vote win. Of course, we don't do that in the United States because we have the Electoral College and a number of difficulties, but then, of course, that only means that there might be extra reasons for holding an election contest in another way that could be tacked on. But still, a simple vote, you can't do it the other way, because if you make the party with less votes win, then people will, if they know about that, then they'll vote differently. You get confusion. Generally, cogency is more difficult when we go into reasoning than it is when we think of our the sensibility of our apprehensive experience. The question of being, the question of Dasein, is neither one nor the other form of cogency, but rather it's a special form of cogency which involves the question of whether these two forms, the awareness and the reason and the let me approach it this way. In antiquity, a great emphasis was put on the individuality of the physical bodies. And for instance, that a human being eats, and nobody else can eat for me, because that food is absorbed in my body and becomes part of my body, my individual body, which is then distinguishable from all other things. Of course, you can say the body is made of particles and so on. But when we go in, and then on the other hand, the mind, the organization, the idea, which Husserl still, and somewhere approaching the year 1900, I believe, said, beyond the year 1900, in fact, he still said the ideas are stronger than all empirical forces. So why? Because it's like zero marginal cost. It's like a video on YouTube. It takes the physical work of putting the video on YouTube is one thing, but whether you have 10 views or, in the case of the most idiotic popular music videos, 1 billion views or more, it's no harder. So the ideas are like that, and the whole civilizations can be organized under them. So this contrast is very like the contrast. The basic, and even more basic, becomes the sharpened contrast when the soul concept falls out and we just have consciousness, or put another way, just our attention floating over things. And then I'm going to make the contrast between things standing beside things and things beside the consciousness. And then you have this question of whether it is cogent to think into this an opposition within itself, which can be neither one nor the other. Aristotle's concept of life, which then goes into a question of whether the question of physics particle analysis, for instance, whether the question of the measurement, for instance, is cogent in the sense of, Nietzsche says, why science? So is it possible to say why science? Isn't science simply about truth? Is science then, in this sense, turn out to be just one more form, one more way to express something that in some way we choose to do as an act? Aristotle says the life is, he says life and the suke, the soul, or suke is the Greek, which we're more familiar with in the Latin form. It corresponds to the Latin psyche. The suke, or soul, is the form of the body, and he basically identifies the suke with life. We all know there's the tripartite Greek psychology, as it's called after the Latin word psychology. What does that mean? The suke is the form of the body. It means that there's a unified principle of motion. The suke, the soul, the psyche, there's a unified principle of motion which makes us into an individual. But that principle of motion can be dominated. If you think of the the famous horse in neighing at the sun under the guidance of a charioteer, which is either the logos dominating the spirited, or the thematic part, and the appetitive, or the lustful part of the body, or you could say, in a way, nous coming to command. And this is basically, this whole way of thinking still rises up in Hegel when we speak of the absolute. It's as though nous would take over. And in the Christian formulation, in the Trinity, so God the Father is, as it were, the archetype, the perfect understanding. the human beings have, and that between the God the Father and the Spirit, our Geist, there's this breathing forth into the intelligibility. Intelligibility is the way human beings know how to act. We understand something and we act according to that, and then Christ, the Son, the body. So these all come into uniformity, and this is the way, this kind of thinking of what life means has come to us in the tradition. So going forward, as we begin to read Heidegger's remarks on Nietzsche's understanding of life, we're seeing that it's not merely that Heidegger is criticizing Nietzsche for failing to question radically enough, but he's also showing that Nietzsche got us to the position where we could do so. And so therefore, Leo Strauss, to the bookend of that, Leo Strauss says that one of the early students of Nietzsche, Georg Simmel, who wrote this great book on the Introduction to the Ethics, which is like 2,000 pages long or so, prepared the current university. The Strauss says that he sanitized Nietzsche for the university culture, and in the form of the fact-value distinction, which is multifarious. Of course, the fact-value distinction is sometimes one points to Hume, and then the is-ought distinction, which is true, but this was developed then by Kant, and then it was thought through by Nietzsche. And on the other hand, you can see the fact-value distinction from the Royal Society going back to the 16th century or so. This emerging out of the dawn of the practice of professional science. In another sense, so there's multiple things going on, but so far as the direct coming to power in the universities goes, you can see it very strongly in Simmel and Weber and the sociology views coming in, and the history of that is again in close detail in Albert Brecht's excellent work, Political Theory. Brecht was a jurist, he wasn't a philosopher, and in some way, therefore, he doesn't try to philosophize, he just lays out very analytically and with great compelling force how that happened. So we want to continue under this notion of trying to this useless mindfulness concerning what life is.